The autumn sun filtered through the massive glass windows of Denver International Airport, casting long shadows across the bustling terminal. 7-year-old Emma Henderson clutched a worn stuffed rabbit in one hand, while her other fingers intertwined with the soft, familiar fur of Max, her German Shepherd service dog. The little girl's pale blue eyes darted nervously around the crowded concourse, watching strangers hurry past with their rolling luggage and determined expressions. Emma was small for her age, her frame delicate, as if the world had handled her too roughly during her years of physical struggles. Her mother, Sarah Henderson, walked slightly ahead, pulling a purple suitcase while keeping one eye on her daughter and one eye on the departure board overhead. It was Tuesday morning, and the airport hummed with the kind of controlled chaos that only major transportation hubs could generate. Families reunited with embraces, business travelers checked their phones obsessively, and children pressed their faces against windows to watch planes take off into the brilliant blue sky. But for Emma and Sarah, this wasn't just another trip. This flight to Boston represented something far more significant than a vacation or a simple visit. This was a journey toward possibility, toward hope, toward a future that Sarah had almost stopped believing in. Emma had been diagnosed with cerebral palsy when she was just 8 months old. The doctors had delivered the news in clinical terms, discussing muscle tone, motor control, and developmental trajectories. For Sarah, it had felt like the world had shifted on its axis. She spent the first year after the diagnosis alternating between desperate research and profound grief. Cerebral palsy affected every child differently, the neurologists explained. Some children would walk independently, others would face significant mobility challenges their entire lives. Emma fell somewhere in the middle, a position that brought its own unique challenges and uncertainties. Growing up, Emma had attended countless physical therapy sessions. Twice a week, sometimes 3 times, she would go to a bright facility filled with colorful equipment and well-meaning therapists who would stretch her muscles, encourage her to move, and celebrate small victories that other children took for granted. A few steps without support, a new balance milestone, a slight improvement in muscle flexibility. These achievements that the therapists celebrated with enthusiasm often felt bittersweet to Sarah, who couldn't help but wonder what her daughter's life might have been without this obstacle. Then came the seizures. When Emma turned 5 years old, her neurologist had noticed something troubling during a routine appointment. Her EEG showed abnormal electrical activity. Within weeks, Emma experienced her first seizure while sitting in her second-grade classroom. She had been reading aloud when her body suddenly went rigid, her small frame convulsing as her classmates and teacher watched in horror. The ambulance ride to the hospital terrified her. The emergency room felt cold and sterile. The medication they prescribed helped, but not completely. Seizures still came unexpectedly, sometimes weeks apart, sometimes multiple times in a single day. They were unpredictable, frightening, and dangerous. Sarah became hypervigilant. She watched Emma constantly, terrified that a seizure might happen during a moment when her daughter was near stairs, water, or any other hazard. The anxiety was exhausting. Emma, sensing her mother's fear, began developing her own anxieties. She didn't want to try new things. She didn't want to play outside as much. She was withdrawing. That's when Sarah's best friend suggested something radical, a service dog. "There are dogs that can predict seizures," had explained over coffee one afternoon while Emma was at school. "They can sense changes in brain chemistry before the seizure actually happens. The dog alerts the person, and they can get to a safe place." Sarah had been skeptical. She already dealt with Emma's mobility challenges and the constant worry about seizures. Adding a dog to that equation seemed overwhelming, but she was also desperate. So desperate that she agreed to attend an information session at a local service dog organization. The training process had taken 2 years. First, Emma had to be evaluated to determine if she was a good candidate for a service dog. Then they had to find the right dog, one with the right temperament, the right intelligence, the right innate ability to sense seizure activity. Service dogs weren't simply trained, they were carefully matched to their handlers based on countless factors. That's when Max came into their lives. Max was a 3-year-old German shepherd with a sleek black and tan coat and dark, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand the world with unusual depth. He had been born and raised specifically to become a service dog. Trainers had worked with him since puppyhood, teaching him commands, teaching him to remain calm under pressure, teaching him to focus on his handler above all other distractions. But Max's greatest gift wasn't something that could be taught. It was his innate ability to sense Emma's body chemistry, changing seconds before a seizure occurred. The bonding process between Emma and Max had been remarkable to witness. Sarah had documented everything. The first moment Emma saw Max, the way the dog had gently approached her, the way Emma's fearful expression had transformed into wonder. Within weeks, the two were inseparable. Max learned Emma's routines. He learned to position himself protectively beside her during her seizure episodes, cushioning her fall and alerting Sarah with trained behaviors. He learned to help her maintain balance while walking, especially on days when her cerebral palsy made mobility particularly challenging. He learned to remain calm when Emma was anxious, his physical presence a steady anchor in her turbulent world. But Max gave Emma something even more important than medical assistance. He gave her confidence. With Max by her side, Emma was willing to try new things. She participated more in school. She smiled more. She laughed more. Max had become her bridge to a life that felt more normal, more possible. Now, as they approached the departure gate at Denver International Airport, Emma held tightly to Max's leash. She wore her favorite purple jacket, and Max wore his official service dog vest, navy blue with white lettering that clearly identified him as a certified service animal. Sarah had checked and rechecked their documentation before leaving home. She had copies of Max's certification, his vaccination records, the official medical letter from Emma's neurologist explaining the necessity of the service dog, and information about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Emma was nervous about flying. She had only flown once before when she was very young. The memory was fragmented, a vague recollection of loud noises and confined spaces, but Max would be with her, and that made all the difference. They had practiced for weeks. Sarah had played recordings of aircraft sounds. They had practiced staying calm. Emma had learned that flying was actually quite safe and that Max would remain by her side the entire time. The real reason for this journey was Boston. An acclaimed medical center, there had been pioneering experimental physical therapy techniques for children with cerebral palsy. The therapy combined cutting-edge technology with specialized physical training. The success rates had been remarkable in preliminary trials. Some children had experienced significant improvements in mobility and muscle control. It wasn't a cure. Cerebral palsy couldn't be cured, but it could potentially change Emma's life trajectory in meaningful ways. Sarah and Emma had spent months on the waiting list. The therapy sessions were expensive and required a 2-week intensive program. Sarah had taken unpaid leave from her job as a graphic designer. They had saved money for months, and finally, they had been accepted into the program. This flight represented a turning point. As Emma stood in the airport with Max by her side, she felt brave despite her nervous energy. She didn't fully understand cerebral palsy or why her body moved differently than other children's bodies. She didn't fully understand seizures or why they happened without warning. But she understood that Max was her protector, her companion, and her champion. Sarah squeezed Emma's small hand gently. "We're going to Boston, baby girl," she whispered, "and we're going to get you the help you deserve." Emma nodded, her fingers tightening around Max's leash. She was ready. They were ready. Neither of them could possibly have imagined that this journey would become so much more than a medical treatment. Neither could have predicted that the next few hours would challenge everything they believed about fairness, kindness, and the power of standing firm in your truth. But that's exactly what was about to happen. The gate area for Flight 427 to Boston was moderately crowded, though not overwhelming for a Tuesday morning. Sarah had timed their arrival perfectly, early enough to avoid the last-minute rushes, but late enough that they wouldn't have to wait long in the somewhat uncomfortable seating. Emma sat quietly beside her mother, Max's head resting peacefully on her lap. The service dog remained calm and alert, his dark eyes occasionally scanning the terminal with the kind of focused awareness that came from years of professional training. Other passengers filed through the gate area, most of them absorbed in their phones or engaged in quiet conversations with traveling companions. Sarah had taken a seat near the gate counter, keeping their boarding passes and documentation easily accessible. She had done this flight routine before, though never with the service dog component. Her anxiety level was moderate, manageable. She had read articles from disability rights organizations confirming her legal protections. She had copies of Emma's official service dog certification from the International Association of Canine Partners. She had a letter from Emma's neurologist. She was prepared. She was confident. She was about to learn that preparation and confidence sometimes mean very little when you encounter someone with the wrong attitude and too much power. The airline gate agent was a pleasant middle-aged woman named Karen. She had smiled warmly when Sarah approached earlier to confirm their seats. "Beautiful dog," Karen had commented, and Sarah had felt a small wave of relief. At least the gate agent seemed reasonable. They would have smooth sailing, or so she thought. At 9:47 a.m., exactly 13 minutes before the scheduled boarding time, Captain Mitchell arrived at the gate. He emerged from the jetway with his flight bag slung over one shoulder, his navy blue pilot's uniform crisp and imposing, his captain's insignia gleaming on his shoulders. He was a tall man in his mid-50s, with gray at his temples and the kind of weathered face that suggested decades spent outdoors. His posture was rigid, military straight, and his expression was all business, the expression of a man who was accustomed to command and obedience. He had just come from the flight deck, where he had been reviewing systems checks with his first officer. The flight was scheduled to leave on time. Everything was proceeding according to protocol. He was in a routine mindset until he glanced toward the waiting passengers and his eyes locked onto Max. Captain Mitchell's entire demeanor changed instantly. His jaw tightened. His eyes narrowed. He did a visible double-take as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. He spoke briefly with Karen, the gate agent, pointing in the direction of Emma and Sarah. Karen's pleasant expression faltered. She glanced nervously at Sarah, then back at the captain. Sarah could read lips well enough to understand that the captain had said something about that dog and liability. Sarah's stomach tightened. She had a sudden, visceral feeling that something was about to go wrong. Captain Mitchell walked directly toward them, his pace purposeful and commanding. His flight bag swung with each step. Other passengers had begun to notice, sensing that some kind of drama was about to unfold. Phone cameras, that ubiquitous feature of modern life, began to emerge discreetly from pockets and purses. "Ma'am," Captain Mitchell said, his voice loud and firm, addressing Sarah directly. He was standing maybe 2 feet away, forcing Sarah to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. "I need to speak with you about your animal." Sarah stood up immediately, reflexively protective of Emma, who remained seated. "Of course, Captain. Is there a problem?" "Yes, there is a problem," he said bluntly. "I cannot allow that German Shepherd on my aircraft. Dogs are unpredictable. I have the safety of 240 passengers and crew members to consider, and I won't be compromising that for anyone's pet." The word pet hit Sarah like a physical blow. She took a breath, steadied herself, and spoke calmly. "Captain, this is Max. He's a certified service dog. He's not a pet. He's a medical device for my daughter who has a disability. He's protected under federal law." Emma looked up at her mother, then at Max, sensing tension. Max, trained to respond to Emma's emotional state, pressed closer to her, his body language protective and calm. I don't care if the dog is wearing a tuxedo and knows quantum physics, Captain Mitchell said, his voice rising slightly. I'm not comfortable with a large dog on my aircraft, and frankly, I don't believe service dog certifications are as reliable as people claim. Anyone can get a certificate online these days. I'm the captain of this aircraft and my word is final. That dog does not fly on my plane. Sarah felt her face flush. Around them, the gate area had gone quiet. Everyone was listening now. Captain, I have all of Max's documentation. His certification is legitimate. He was trained through an accredited organization over 2 years. My daughter has cerebral palsy and epilepsy. Max alerts her to seizures. He's as essential to her well-being as a wheelchair would be for another child. Then perhaps your daughter should travel with a wheelchair instead, Captain Mitchell said coldly. But that dog is not boarding this aircraft. That's not an option, and you know it, Sarah said, her voice steady despite the trembling she felt inside. What you're attempting to do is illegal. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, I have the right to fly with my service dog. Denying me access because of disability-related discrimination is a federal violation. Captain Mitchell's face darkened. Are you threatening me? I'm not threatening you, Captain. I'm informing you of the law. Max has every right to be on this aircraft, just as Emma has the right to access the accommodations she needs as a disabled passenger. Other passengers were now watching openly. A few were filming on their phones. The gate agent, Karen, looked incredibly uncomfortable, clearly caught between respecting the captain's authority and knowing, on some level, that his position was legally questionable. Listen here, Captain Mitchell said, his voice dropping but somehow becoming more menacing. I've been flying for 35 years. I've never had an animal on my aircraft and I'm not about to start now. You have 2 choices. You can leave that dog with someone or you can get off this flight. Those are your options. Emma began to cry quietly. Sarah reached down and pulled her daughter close, Max pressing protectively against them both. Captain, please, Sarah said, and there was genuine pleading in her voice now. My daughter has waited months for this treatment in Boston. We've prepared for this. Max is certified. This is our legal right. And I have a legal right to ensure the safety of my aircraft, Captain Mitchell countered. My decision stands. Now, are you going to check that dog or are you getting off the flight? Other passengers were openly staring now. A businessman near them was definitely recording on his phone. A woman in her 60s shook her head disapprovingly at the captain. But the captain seemed indifferent to the growing audience and the obvious tension his stance was creating. Sarah's mind raced. She thought about all the months of waiting. She thought about the experimental therapy waiting for Emma in Boston. She thought about her daughter's future, potentially hanging in the balance. She thought about the countless hours she had spent researching and advocating for her daughter's rights. She thought about the unfairness of having to fight for something that should be automatic, her daughter's right to access the medical device that kept her safe. Captain Mitchell, Sarah said, her voice firm despite her racing heart, what you're doing is against federal law. I have documentation proving Max is a legitimate service dog. I'm not leaving this flight. My daughter deserves to be here and so does Max. If you have concerns about his behavior, I welcome any reasonable accommodations or monitoring. But I will not abandon my daughter's service dog, and I will not abandon this flight. The captain's face went from red to a shade of purple that actually looked concerning. Fine, he said, his voice dripping with anger. Then we'll see what the airline has to say about this. He turned and walked back toward the gate counter, where he immediately began speaking with Karen in an intense, hushed conversation. Sarah could see the gate agent's eyes widening as the captain gestured emphatically and pointed back toward Sarah and Emma. Emma was shaking now, her small body trembling as she clutched Max. "Mommy, I'm scared," she whispered. Sarah held her daughter, fighting back her own tears. "It's okay, baby. Max is okay. You're okay. I'm not going to let anyone take him away from you." But even as she said the words, Sarah wasn't entirely sure what was about to happen next. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched Captain Mitchell and the gate agent engage in what appeared to be an intense debate. She could see Karen gesturing, pointing to papers on the counter, and then back toward Sarah. The captain was shaking his head firmly, his body language radiating absolute conviction. Sarah pulled Emma closer, feeling her daughter's fear mingling with her own anxiety. Emma's small fingers gripped Max's collar tightly, and the dog remained perfectly still, his training evident in his composed demeanor despite the emotional turmoil surrounding them. Around them, the other passengers had become an audience. Some tried to be discreet in their observation, glancing occasionally while maintaining the pretense of looking at their phones or reading boarding passes. Others were less subtle. A woman in her 60s had openly turned to watch, her expression one of obvious disapproval directed at Captain Mitchell. A businessman in a gray suit was definitely recording on his phone, his device held at just the right angle to capture the drama unfolding in the gate area. A young couple whispered to each other, pointing toward Emma and Max. Sarah stood up, gathering what remained of her courage. She was a graphic designer by profession, not a lawyer. She had never been particularly confrontational. She preferred to avoid conflict, to find compromises to keep the peace. But standing there in that airport gate area, watching her daughter cry, watching her daughter's lifeline being threatened by a man who refused to acknowledge a basic legal right, something shifted inside Sarah. Her fear transformed into resolve. Her hesitation transformed into determination. Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mommy, what's happening? Why is the captain being mean?" Sarah knelt down to Emma's level, looking directly into her daughter's terrified blue eyes. "Baby, that man doesn't understand about Max yet, but I'm going to help him understand. Max is your service dog. That's not going to change, no matter what anyone says. Do you understand me?" Emma nodded, but she was still trembling. Max pressed his entire body against Emma protectively, his trained instincts kicking in as he sensed his handler's distress. This was exactly what Max had been trained for, to provide physical and emotional support during moments of crisis. Sarah stood up, her decision made. She was not leaving this gate area without resolution. She was not checking her daughter's medical device in cargo like it was luggage. She was not going to teach her daughter that standing up for what was right was something to be ashamed of. Emma had already learned too many lessons about accommodation and limitation. Sarah was not about to add another one. She approached the gate counter where Captain Mitchell was still engaged in conversation with Karen. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady and clear. "Captain Mitchell, I need to say something, and I need you to listen to me carefully." The captain turned, his expression dismissive. "Ma'am, I'm conducting airline business. Please step back." "No," Sarah said firmly. "I'm not stepping back. What you're doing is illegal, and I need you to understand that." The captain's jaw clenched. Other passengers had now stopped pretending not to pay attention. Several phones were definitely recording now. Sarah could feel the weight of that audience, but she pushed through her discomfort. "My daughter has a disability," Sarah continued, her voice steady and measured. "Max is a certified service dog. That certification is legitimate. It comes from an accredited organization. It has been validated by veterinarians and trainers and disability specialists. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is federal law, Captain, I have the right to travel with my service dog. Denying me that right based on my daughter's disability is discrimination. It's illegal. It's also morally wrong." Captain Mitchell's face reddened. "I don't need a civics lesson from you, ma'am. I'm the captain of this aircraft, and I have ultimate authority over who and what boards my plane." "Your authority doesn't override federal law," Sarah shot back. "You can't refuse me because I'm a woman. You can't refuse me because of my race. And you can't refuse me because my daughter has a disability and needs a service dog. These are all protected categories under federal law." "That dog could be dangerous," Captain Mitchell said. though his voice had taken on a somewhat defensive tone, as if he were running out of legitimate arguments. Max has been professionally trained for 2 years specifically to work as a service dog, Sarah replied. He's more disciplined and better trained than most pets that travel on airlines every single day in the cabin with their owners. Max goes through rigorous training standards that far exceed what most animals experience. He's not a threat. He's a medical device. Karen, the gate agent, looked extremely uncomfortable. She kept glancing between Sarah and Captain Mitchell, clearly caught in the middle of conflicting authorities. The captain's command versus the legal requirements of the airline company itself. "I'm going to speak with management," Captain Mitchell announced, turning away from Sarah abruptly. "Yes, please do," Sarah called after him, "because they're going to tell you the same thing I'm telling you. Your airline's own policies likely comply with the ADA, and if they don't, they're in violation of federal law." As Captain Mitchell disappeared through a door leading to the back offices, Sarah's legs suddenly felt weak. She walked back to where Emma was sitting and lowered herself into the seat next to her daughter. Emma immediately leaned into her, and Sarah wrapped her arms around the small girl. Max remained pressed against Emma, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of conflict. "Did you stand up to the captain, Mommy?" Emma asked quietly. "I did, baby. I did," Sarah whispered, kissing the top of her daughter's head. "Because what he's trying to do isn't fair, and I'm not going to let him hurt you." 15 minutes passed, then 20. The gate agent occasionally looked over at them with an expression Sarah couldn't quite read. Some passengers began to grow impatient, wondering when boarding would actually commence. Others seemed deeply invested in how this situation would resolve. The businessman continued recording intermittently, capturing what he clearly sensed was a significant moment. Sarah's mind raced through worst-case scenarios. What if the airline sided with the captain? What if they had to abandon this flight? What if Emma didn't get her Boston treatment? What if she had to pursue legal action? Could she afford a lawyer? How long would that take? All the while, Emma sat beside her, silent and frightened, her small hand never releasing Max's collar. Then, unexpectedly, a new sound cut through Sarah's anxious thoughts. It was the sound of an electric wheelchair motor approaching from the corridor near the gates. Sarah looked up. A woman in a sleek electric wheelchair rolled toward them with remarkable speed and precision. She was probably in her 50s, African American, with an air of quiet confidence and intelligence that was almost palpable. Her business attire was impeccable, a tailored suit and professional glasses. Most significantly, she had her own service dog, a golden retriever with a vest identical to Max's, lying calmly across her lap. The woman rolled directly toward Sarah's seating area and positioned herself beside Emma. "Excuse me," the woman said, her voice carrying authority and education. "I couldn't help but overhear what was happening. I'm Dr. Hammond, and I'm a civil rights attorney specializing in disability law. May I ask what's going on?" Sarah felt a surge of emotion, relief mixed with gratitude and a glimmer of hope. Someone who understood, someone who had expertise, someone who had already fought similar battles. "The captain is refusing to allow my daughter's service dog on the flight," Sarah explained, her voice breaking slightly. "He says the dog is a liability. He won't accept our certification. He's telling us either to leave Max with someone or get off the flight." Dr. Hammond's expression hardened. She looked toward the gate area where Captain Mitchell was still back in the office, and then back to Sarah and Emma. "That is a clear violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act," Dr. Hammond said firmly. "Not only that, it's discriminatory based on disability, and I can guarantee you the airline knows better." Sarah felt tears prickling her eyes. "I tried to tell him that. He won't listen." "Well," Dr. Hammond said, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she had had this conversation many times before, "let me have a conversation with him. I think he'll listen to me." As Dr. Hammond began to wheel herself toward the gate counter, Sarah realized that sometimes, when you stand up for what's right, even if you're terrified and unprepared, the universe occasionally sends you an unexpected ally. Dr. Hammond moved with the kind of purposeful efficiency that came from years of navigating the world from a wheelchair. Her golden retriever remained perfectly calm on her lap, trained to maintain that position even as the wheelchair moved. The service dog's name was Bailey, and like Max, Bailey had been professionally trained to assist his handler with disabilities. In Dr. Hammond's case, providing mobility assistance and alerting to changes in her blood pressure that could indicate medical emergencies. As Dr. Hammond rolled toward the gate counter, Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions. Relief that someone with expertise and authority was intervening, gratitude that a stranger was willing to step into this conflict, but also a lingering anxiety about whether even an attorney could actually change the captain's mind. Sarah had learned, over the years of advocating for Emma, that people were often remarkably resistant to facts when those facts contradicted their preconceived notions. Dr. Hammond reached the gate counter where Corinne was still waiting, looking increasingly anxious. The captain's office door was closed, but through the small glass window, Sarah could see Captain Mitchell inside, apparently on the phone, his gestures animated and his expression tense. "Excuse me," Dr. Hammond said to Corinne, her voice carrying the kind of professional authority that made people pay attention. "I need to speak with Captain Mitchell about a legal matter regarding disability discrimination." Corinne's eyes widened. He's on the phone right now, can I?" "He needs to take this conversation," Dr. Hammond interrupted politely but firmly. "Please get him." Something in Dr. Hammond's tone made Corinne move immediately. She knocked on the captain's office door and gestured for him to come out. Captain Mitchell emerged, his expression irritated, clearly annoyed at yet another interruption. When he saw Dr. Hammond in her wheelchair, something flickered across his face. A moment of recognition, perhaps, that this was a different kind of conversation than the one he'd been having with Sarah. "Yes," Captain Mitchell said, his tone clipped and professional but with an edge of impatience. "Captain Mitchell, my name is Dr. Hammond. I'm a civil rights attorney with 15 years of experience specializing in disability law, ADA compliance, and discrimination cases," Dr. Hammond said, presenting this information with the confidence of someone who had said it many times before. "I witnessed your interaction with the family at the gate, and I need to inform you that what you're attempting to do is a direct violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." Captain Mitchell's jaw clenched. "Ma'am, I appreciate your opinion, but this is an airline matter. I have authority over my aircraft." "You absolutely do have authority over your aircraft," Dr. Hammond acknowledged. "But that authority operates within the framework of federal law. The ADA is federal law, Captain. It supersedes your authority as a pilot. You cannot discriminate against passengers based on disability. Full stop. That service dog is a medical device for a child with a disability. Denying that child access to her service dog is discrimination." "That dog could pose a safety risk," Captain Mitchell said, repeating his earlier argument, but now it sounded hollow and defensive. "Service dogs undergo rigorous training specifically designed to ensure they don't pose safety risks," Dr. Hammond replied smoothly. "In fact, statistically, service dogs have fewer behavioral incidents on aircraft than pets that fly in cabins with their owners every single day. Service dogs are trained to the highest behavioral standards. If you deny access to this service dog, you're essentially claiming that the dog's behavior is your concern, which means you're also claiming that all pets on your aircraft pose equivalent concerns. Do you deny pets access to your aircraft?" Captain Mitchell's face flushed. "That's different." "How is it different?" Dr. Hammond pressed. "The dog's behavior is either a legitimate safety concern or it isn't. If you allow pets but not service dogs, you're violating the ADA. If you don't allow pets, then you're essentially acknowledging that you allow pets despite potential behavioral concerns, which contradicts your stated position about this service dog." Sarah watched from the seating area, feeling her anxiety gradually transform into something else. Hope, perhaps, or at least the possibility of hope. Emma, sensing the shift in the situation, looked up at her mother with a questioning expression. "Why is the lady in the wheelchair talking to the captain?" Emma whispered. "She's helping us, baby," Sarah whispered back. "She knows the law better than the captain does." Captain Mitchell was beginning to look genuinely flustered now. "Look, I've been flying for 35 years. And in those 35 years, have you received training on ADA compliance and disability accommodation?" Dr. Hammond asked. "Because if you haven't, that might explain the legal exposure you're currently creating for both yourself and your airline." Other passengers were now openly watching. The businessman who had been recording earlier was definitely still recording. Several people had their phones out. One woman was making notes on a piece of paper. Sarah realized with a start that this moment was being documented. Whatever happened next, there would be witnesses and video evidence. "I'm going to call my operations manager," Captain Mitchell said stiffly. "Excellent idea," Dr. Hammond said. "Because your operations manager will confirm that the airline is in compliance with the ADA and that you are, in fact, required to allow this service dog to board. In the meantime, I should mention that I have documented this entire interaction. I have witnesses." She gestured around the gate area, where numerous passengers were clearly paying attention. "And I have video evidence from multiple passengers recording this exchange. If you continue to deny this child access to her service dog, you're creating a documented case of disability discrimination that would be remarkably easy to prove in court." Captain Mitchell's face had gone from red to a shade of pale that actually looked concerning. He stood there for a long moment, clearly processing the implications of what Dr. Hammond had said. 35 years of flying, a career built on discipline and authority. The possibility that one decision made in anger could create legal liability not just for the airline but potentially for him personally. "I need to speak with operations," he said finally, his voice much quieter than before. "Of course," Dr. Hammond said, her tone now almost gracious, as if she had won a minor victory and was willing to be magnanimous about it. "I'll be right here, and I'll be documenting everything that happens next." Captain Mitchell disappeared back into the office. This time, the door closed with slightly more force than necessary, suggesting frustration and stress. Dr. Hammond rolled her wheelchair back to where Sarah and Emma were sitting, with Bailey the golden retriever remaining perfectly calm through the entire exchange. "That should buy us some time," Dr. Hammond said, positioning her wheelchair so she was facing Sarah directly. "He's going to call operations, and they're going to panic when they realize they have a documented discrimination case playing out in their gate area in front of multiple witnesses and cameras." "I can't thank you enough," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "I didn't know what to do. I tried to explain the law to him, but he just wouldn't listen." "People often don't listen until they understand there are consequences," Dr. Hammond said. "Captain Mitchell is probably a good pilot, but like many people, he's never had to learn about disability rights and accommodation. He made assumptions based on fear and prejudice, and now he's learning that those assumptions have legal ramifications." Emma, feeling braver now that an adult authority figure had intervened on their behalf, spoke up quietly. "Are you a lawyer?" "I am," Dr. Hammond confirmed, smiling warmly at the little girl. "And Bailey and I both understand what it's like to need a service dog. I use Bailey for medical alerts, just like Max helps you. So I know how important it is to have your dog with you. No one should ever try to take that away from you." Emma looked down at Max, who was now resting his head on her lap and seemed to relax slightly. The immediate crisis hadn't been fully resolved, but the momentum had shifted. An authority figure had intervened. The legal implications had been made clear. The presence of documentation and witnesses had elevated the stakes. Sarah sat back in her chair, exhausted from the stress but also holding onto a fragile sense of hope. Around them, The gate area had taken on a strange quality, half airport terminal, half courtroom, with the outcome of this case potentially affecting not just one family's journey, but the airline's policies and the captain's career. 15 minutes passed, then 20. The gate agent continued to look uncomfortable. Other passengers continued to watch and record, and in the back office, Captain Mitchell was presumably having a very difficult phone conversation with his operations manager. Finally, the office door opened again. Captain Mitchell stood in the small office behind the gate counter, his hand gripping the phone so tightly his knuckles had turned white. On the other end of the line was Michael, the regional operations manager for Denver International Airport, his boss's boss's boss. Michael's voice was professionally controlled, but underneath that control could hear barely restrained panic. "Tell me again exactly what happened," Michael was saying for the second time, as if repetition might somehow change the facts. Recounted the situation: a service dog, a disabled child, a family trying to board Flight 427, his refusal based on safety concerns, the intervention of a woman claiming to be a civil rights attorney with video evidence and documentation, passengers recording everything, a gate area that had essentially become a spectacle. Michael said slowly, and the use of his first name instead of his title indicated how serious this was. "Do you understand what you've done? Do you actually comprehend the position you've put this airline in?" "I was concerned about safety," said, and even to his own ears, his voice sounded weak and defensive. "Service dogs are not a safety concern. We've had service dogs on aircraft for years without incident. In fact, service dogs are trained to higher behavioral standards than most of the pets we allow in the cabin. More importantly, and I want you to listen to me very carefully, what you've done is potentially a textbook case of disability discrimination under the ADA." Felt something twist in his stomach. He had been flying for 35 years. He had an exemplary safety record. He had never had a serious incident. His career had been built on precision, discipline, and adherence to protocol. The idea that one decision made in anger could jeopardize all of that was almost incomprehensible. "I didn't discriminate," said. "I was thinking about passenger safety." "If you were concerned about safety, you would have evaluated the specific dog's behavior and training credentials. Instead, you made a blanket refusal based on the dog being a German Shepherd. That's profiling. That's discrimination based on disability. An attorney present in that gate area has already documented the incident. Multiple passengers have video recordings. We have a gate agent who was present. Do you understand that this airline could face federal violations? That you personally could face legal liability?" Sat down heavily in the office chair. His hands were shaking. "What do I do?" "First, you're going to allow that service dog to board your aircraft. You're going to treat that family with courtesy and respect. You're going to fly that plane professionally and safely. Then, you're going to report to my office on Wednesday morning, and we're going to have a very detailed conversation about ADA compliance and your future role as a captain with this airline." The line went dead. Michael had hung up without waiting for a response. Stared at the phone in his hand. His career, 35 years, thousands of flights completed without incident, and now one decision made because he hadn't taken the time to understand something, one decision made in ignorance and fear, and everything was in jeopardy. He thought about his daughter, Emma. Not the Emma sitting at the gate with the service dog, but his own daughter, Emma Mitchell, who was 9 years old. 3 months ago, she had started showing signs of autism. His wife, Jennifer, had been researching specialists and interventions. She had mentioned, just last week over dinner, that some families with autistic children were exploring service dogs as a potential accommodation. At the time had been dismissive. "We don't need a dog," he had said. "We'll manage." But would they? He thought about Emma's struggles with anxiety, her difficulty in crowded situations, her occasional meltdowns when things didn't go according to her routine. He thought about what Jennifer had read, how service dogs could help autistic children by providing grounding and pressure therapy during moments of anxiety. He thought about how a trained dog might give his daughter confidence, might help her navigate a world that didn't always understand or accommodate people who were different. And here he was, denying another child that exact same accommodation. Another child who was already managing cerebral palsy and seizures. Another child who needed that dog just as much as his own daughter might someday need one. Felt something break open inside him, not dramatically, but more like a dam developing a small crack, and suddenly water was beginning to seep through. He had been wrong. Not just legally wrong, though that was certainly true, but morally wrong, fundamentally wrong in a way that went beyond policy and protocol. He stood up, took a breath, and opened the office door. The gate area seemed to have frozen in a tableau. Dr. Hammond was still positioned near the seating area, Bailey the golden retriever on her lap. Sarah was sitting with her arm around Emma, who was hugging the German shepherd. Passengers were scattered throughout the gate, some still recording on their phones, others just watching. The gate agent, Karen, looked up hopefully when emerged. Walked directly to Sarah and Emma. His movements were slow, deliberate, and humble in a way that his earlier authority had not been. He knelt down to Emma's eye level. This was important. He needed to do this right. "I'm truly sorry for upsetting you and your family," he said quietly, and he was surprised to find that his voice was thick with emotion. "I've never flown with a service dog before, and instead of taking the time to understand how they work and how important they are, I let my fears make me behave badly. That wasn't right. I wasn't right." Emma, who had been terrified just minutes before, looked up at him with surprise. She didn't say anything, just watched him with her pale blue eyes. "Your dog is very special," continued, looking at Max. "May I see what he does?" Sarah hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. Over the next few minutes, Emma, with her mother's encouragement, showed Captain Mitchell some of Max's trained behaviors. Max demonstrated his alert sequence, the specific movements he made when he sensed Emma's body was about to experience a seizure. Emma explained how Max helped her when she was walking and her balance wasn't good. She showed him how Max positioned himself during her anxiety episodes, providing deep pressure therapy through his weight. As watched, he felt tears forming in his eyes. This extraordinary animal, this carefully trained medical device, was performing functions that probably meant the difference between a child who was isolated and anxious and a child who could engage with the world with confidence. He had been about to deny this child access to that support based on nothing more than unfounded fear. "He's extraordinary," whispered, and he meant it with every fiber of his being. "I see now what I didn't understand before." He stood up slowly, looking at Sarah directly. His professional composure was cracked, and his sincerity was unmistakable. "Please board the aircraft. You and your family are absolutely welcome here. I apologize for the delay and the stress I caused you." Other passengers began to clap, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. It was an unusual gesture in an airport gate area, but it felt appropriate. Had made a public mistake and he had publicly acknowledged it. That mattered. Sarah looked stunned. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you so much." As Sarah began gathering their belongings to board, approached Dr. Hammond. "I want you to know that I'm going to be reporting this incident to my airline management and requesting formal training on disability accommodation and ADA compliance," he said. "What I did today was wrong, and I'm going to work to ensure I never make that mistake again." Dr. Hammond nodded approvingly. "I appreciate your willingness to learn, Captain. That's how we make real change." Felt like he had aged 10 years in the last 30 minutes. His career wasn't over, at least he didn't think it was, but it had certainly been shaken. More importantly, his perspective had shifted fundamentally. He had been forced to confront his own ignorance and fear, and in doing so, he had glimpsed the possibility of being better, as a pilot, as a professional, and perhaps most importantly, as a father preparing to support a daughter who would need accommodation and acceptance from a world that didn't always provide either. The gate area began to clear as passengers started boarding. Emma and Max walked past, and the little girl looked back at him with something that might have been forgiveness in her expression. Stood there, watching them board his aircraft, and made a silent promise to himself. He was going to do better. He was going to be better. Emma walked slowly through the jetway, Max's leash held firmly in her small hand while Sarah stayed close beside her daughter. The little girl's confidence had visibly returned now that the immediate conflict had resolved. Other passengers filed past them, some offering warm smiles, others still shooting curious glances at the service dog. Emma held her head a little higher with each step. She had stood her ground. Her mother had stood their ground. And an adult had listened and changed his mind. As they entered the aircraft cabin, the flight attendants greeted them with genuine warmth. The gate agent had apparently radioed ahead because the crew seemed aware of the situation and were prepared to be accommodating. A female flight attendant in her 40s smiled at Emma and Max. "Welcome aboard, sweetie. Your dog is absolutely welcome here. We're so glad to have you flying with us today." Sarah had reserved seats in the forward cabin near the emergency exit row, extra legroom for Emma's mobility needs. They found their row, and Sarah helped Emma settle into the window seat while Max positioned himself in the space by Emma's feet, exactly as he had been trained to do. The dog understood aircraft protocol as well as any passenger might. His training had included multiple flights, multiple exposure to the confined space of an airplane cabin, multiple practice sessions with takeoff and landing procedures. Back in the flight deck, Captain Mitchell was conducting his pre-flight checks with First Officer James. James was younger, mid-30s, with 15 years of flying experience and an easygoing demeanor. He glanced at with obvious concern. "Everything okay, Captain?" James asked. Gate agent radioed something about a situation with a service dog. Took a deep breath. He could have downplayed it, moved on, pretended the entire incident was inconsequential. Instead, he decided to be honest. "I made a mistake," said quietly. "A significant mistake. There's a family aboard with a child who has cerebral palsy and a service dog that alerts her to seizures. I initially tried to deny them boarding based on unfounded safety concerns. A civil rights attorney corrected my misunderstanding of the ADA, and I realized I was wrong." James's eyebrows rose. "That sounds like it could have gotten ugly." "It nearly did," confirmed. "But it didn't, because someone with expertise and empathy stepped in and helped me see my error. That family is aboard now, and I want to ensure they have the absolute best flight experience possible." James nodded slowly. "I'm guessing this is going to be one of those moments that stays with you." "Absolutely," said. "One of those moments that changes things." The pre-flight checks continued, and performed each task with his usual precision. But his mind kept returning to Emma, both Emmas, actually. The 7-year-old on his aircraft with cerebral palsy and epilepsy, and his own 9-year-old daughter at home, navigating the early stages of autism diagnosis. When he and James were satisfied that all systems were functioning optimally, did something he rarely did. He radioed the main cabin crew and asked if he might briefly visit the passenger cabin to personally welcome the family aboard. This was not standard protocol, but given the circumstances, it seemed appropriate. Walked back through the cabin, his tall frame slightly stooped to avoid the overhead compartments. He found Emma and Sarah in their seats. Emma was looking out the window at the Denver airport activity below, while Max remained perfectly still at her feet, his training evident in his unwavering focus on his handler. "Hello again," said, stopping at their row. "I wanted to personally make sure you were comfortable." Emma looked up and for a moment saw uncertainty in her expression, then recognition, then a tentative smile. "Hi, Captain," she said softly. "How are you feeling?" asked, genuinely interested. Is Max comfortable? Is there anything you need for a better flight experience? Max is fine, Emma said, her voice growing slightly more confident. He likes flying. He's been on planes before. He seems like he knows exactly what to do, observed. He pulled up the jump seat across the aisle and sat down, making himself at eye level with Emma again. This was unusual behavior for a captain. Most flew the plane and remained distant from passengers, but was no longer interested in maintaining distance. I'd like to understand more about what Max does for you if you're comfortable telling me. Over the next 10 minutes, Emma explained her life with Max in the simple, direct way that children do. She explained about her cerebral palsy and how it affected her balance and the way her muscles worked. She explained about seizures and how scary they were, and how Max gave her warning so she could get to a safe place. She explained about anxiety and how Max's weight pressing against her helped calm her down. She explained about going to school and how Max helped her make friends, because kids were less intimidated by her when they understood she had a specially trained dog helping her. Listened with rapt attention. He asked questions, thoughtful questions that suggested genuine interest rather than obligation. What did Max eat? How long had she had him? What was her favorite thing about being his handler? What was the hardest part? Sarah watched this interaction with obvious surprise. She had expected professional politeness. She had received something far more genuine, a man who was genuinely trying to understand, who was asking the right questions, who seemed to be experiencing some kind of significant realization. "Captain," Sarah said carefully, "I want to thank you for your change of heart. That took integrity." Turned to her. It also took the intervention of a civil rights attorney and multiple passengers recording everything. I'm not sure I would have changed my mind otherwise, and that troubles me deeply. It means I was wrong based on fear and ignorance, and I would have hurt your daughter based on those things. That's a hard realization to sit with. "But you did change your mind," Sarah said gently. "That matters." "My daughter is 9 years old," said abruptly, the connection spilling out of him unexpectedly. "She was recently diagnosed with autism. My wife has been researching service dogs as a potential accommodation. I was resistant to the idea. I thought it was excessive, that we should just adapt as a family." He looked at Emma. "Watching you with Max, watching how he helps you navigate the world with more confidence, it's made me realize that my daughter shouldn't have to do all the adapting. That she deserves support. That I should be supporting her, not dismissing the tools that could help her." Emma reached out and touched his hand. "Max helped me too," she said simply. "I was scared a lot before Max. Now I'm not scared as much." Felt tears pricking his eyes. He blinked them back, not wanting to be overwhelmed in the cabin in front of other passengers. But the emotion was genuine and profound. "I'm going to help my daughter get a service dog," he said to Emma. "Because of you, because you showed me what that looks like." Emma smiled, a real genuine smile that transformed her face. "That's good, Captain. Service dogs are really helpful." Stood up, composing himself. "We should be pushing back from the gate in a few minutes. I want you to know that if you need anything during the flight, you just let the flight attendants know. You and Max are VIP passengers today." As he walked back to the flight deck, felt fundamentally changed. The anger he had felt earlier, the defensive, authoritative anger, had been replaced by something deeper and more important, humility. And along with that humility came clarity about his own life, his own daughter, and the accommodations and support she deserved. James looked at him as he settled back into the captain's seat. "Everything okay back there?" "Actually," said, pulling on his headset, "yes, everything is more than okay. Let's prepare for pushback. We're going to give those people the smoothest flight they've ever experienced." As the aircraft began to move away from the gate, Captain Mitchell felt something shift inside him, not just resignation or acceptance, but genuine transformation. Emma had taught him something far more valuable than any training program could. That sometimes the most important thing a leader can do is listen, learn, and change. Flight 427 climbed steadily into the Colorado sky, banking slightly as it navigated the departure corridor away from Denver International Airport. Inside the cabin, Emma pressed her face against the window, watching the sprawling city below grow smaller and smaller. Max remained in his designated position at her feet, his body relaxed but alert, his training allowing him to remain calm during the vibration and noise of takeoff. Sarah watched her daughter with a mixture of relief and joy. Just an hour ago, they had been uncertain whether this flight would even happen. Now, they were airborne, heading toward Boston and the experimental therapy that could potentially transform Emma's life. More than that, they were on a plane with a captain who had experienced a genuine change of heart, a man who had been willing to admit he was wrong and alter his perspective. The flight attendants moved through the cabin efficiently, offering beverages and snacks to passengers. One of them, a woman named with kind eyes and a warm smile, paused at Emma's row. "How are you doing, sweetie?" asked, directing her attention to Emma. "Can I get you or your mom anything?" "Apple juice, please," Emma said politely, "and maybe some pretzels." "Absolutely," said, "and can I get you anything, ma'am?" "Water, thank you," Sarah replied. As moved on, she made a mental note of the family. She had overheard the gate incident through crew communications. The entire airline staff on duty that morning was aware of what had almost happened. Captain Mitchell had apparently radioed the crew personally to explain the situation and to ensure exceptional service for this particular family. That kind of personal directive was unusual, intended to honor it. About 45 minutes into the flight, once they had reached cruising altitude and the aircraft had settled into steady, smooth flying, an announcement came through the cabin intercom. It was Captain Mitchell's voice, warm and welcoming. "Ladies, and this is Captain Mitchell. I want to thank you all for flying with us today. We're having perfect weather conditions all the way to Boston, and we should arrive right on schedule. Before we continue, I'd like to make a special request. I'm inviting a very special passenger and her family to visit the flight deck. This is not something we usually do, but I believe today calls for an exception. If Emma and her family would like to come forward, we'd love to show you our workplace." Sarah's eyes widened. This was highly unusual. Cockpit visits for passengers were rare and generally only happened on special occasions or under very specific circumstances. She looked at Emma, whose face had lit up with wonder. "Really, Mommy?" Emma asked. "Can we go see where the captain flies the plane?" "I think that would be amazing," Sarah said, standing up and offering her hand to Emma. Max stood as well, his leash already in Emma's hand. As they made their way forward through the cabin, passengers watched with interest. Some smiled knowingly, understanding that this family had been through something significant, opened the flight deck door, and they stepped into the cockpit. Captain Mitchell was seated in the left seat, First Officer James in the right seat. Both men turned to greet them, immediately stood up from his seat, something pilots rarely did while the aircraft was in flight. "Emma, welcome to the flight deck," said warmly. "This is where James and I control the aircraft. We're at 35,000 feet right now, cruising at about 500 miles per hour. Would you like to see what's ahead of us?" He gestured toward the windscreen, where the vast expanse of sky and distant landscape spread out before them. Emma's eyes grew wide. She had never seen anything quite like it. The infinite sky, the clouds, the sense of limitless space. "Wow," Emma breathed, "it's so big." "It really is," agreed. "Here, come sit in my seat for a moment and get the full view." With Sarah's assistance, Emma carefully settled into the captain's seat, her small frame looking almost comical in the large, sophisticated chair. Max positioned himself beside the seat, close enough to remain in contact with his handler. Stood nearby, pointing out landmarks visible from their current altitude and explaining the various instruments on the control panel. "That instrument there tells us our altitude," he explained, pointing. "That one shows our airspeed, and this panel controls all the major systems of the aircraft. It looks complicated, but once you understand what each thing does, it makes sense. You have to remember a lot, Emma observed. We do, confirmed. But I love it. I love flying. I love the responsibility of keeping hundreds of people safe while they're traveling. It's a privilege. Sarah stood in the background with James, who was keeping a professional eye on the instruments and the aircraft systems while attended to their visitors. She felt grateful for his quiet discretion in allowing his captain this moment. After about 10 minutes, gently helped Emma out of the seat. She was reluctant to leave, but understood that the pilots needed to focus on flying the plane. "Before you go," said to Emma, his voice becoming more serious and personal, "I want to tell you something important, something I realized today because of you." Emma looked up at him, her pale blue eyes attentive. "I have a daughter," continued. "She's 9 years old and her name is Emma too. Not long ago, she was diagnosed with autism. At first, I didn't know how to handle it. I thought it meant she was broken or that something had gone wrong. I was scared, and because I was scared, I wasn't being the supportive father I should be." Knelt down to Emma's eye level again, a gesture that was becoming familiar and comfortable for both of them. "But watching you today, seeing how Max helps you, seeing how you navigate the world with confidence because you have that support, it's shown me something I didn't understand before. My Emma doesn't need me to fix her or make her normal. She needs me to help her find the tools and support she needs to be her best self, just like Max helps you." He paused, and Sarah could see genuine emotion in his expression. "I'm going to bring my Emma to see a service dog organization," continued. "We're going to explore whether a service dog might help her the way Max helps you, and it's because of you. You've changed how I think about my own daughter. You've changed how I think about disability and support. You've changed me, Emma, and I want you to know how grateful I am for that." Emma reached out and hugged the captain, a gesture that took everyone in the cockpit by surprise, but that felt absolutely right. Hugged her back, his eyes glistening with tears that he didn't attempt to hide. When Sarah, Emma, and Max returned to their seats in the cabin, Sarah felt as though something profound had shifted. This flight had become more than transportation. It had become a moment of genuine human connection, a moment where a child's courage had inspired an adult to reconsider his perspectives and his priorities. The flight attendant had noticed the emotional nature of their cockpit visit. She returned to their seats a short while later with a surprise, a special meal that wasn't on the standard flight menu, chicken nuggets shaped like dinosaurs for Emma, and a more substantial meal for Sarah. "Compliments of the captain," said with a warm smile. "He wanted to make sure you had a wonderful flight." As Emma ate her dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets and gazed out the window at the endless sky, she seemed to embody a kind of peaceful confidence. She had advocated for herself and Max at the gate. She had stood firm in the face of injustice. And in doing so, she had not only secured her own passage to Boston, but she had also opened the eyes of a man who would now be better able to support his own daughter. Sarah reached over and squeezed Emma's hand. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. Emma smiled, her attention still on the view outside the window. "I'm proud of us, Mommy," she said. "Me and Max helped the captain's other Emma. That's good, right?" "That's very good, baby," Sarah confirmed. "That's very good indeed." 2 weeks after Flight 427 touched down at Boston Logan International Airport, Emma sat in a specialized physical therapy session at Boston Children's Hospital, surrounded by cutting-edge equipment designed to help children with cerebral palsy improve mobility and muscle control. The experimental therapy was unlike anything she had experienced in Denver. Instead of traditional stretching and exercises, the program used robotic-assisted gait training combined with virtual reality environments that made rehabilitation feel almost like play. Emma walked alongside a sophisticated robotic device that provided precise support and feedback, helping her muscles learn new movement patterns. Max was positioned nearby, out of the way but close enough to monitor his handler. The therapy sessions lasted 3 hours per day, 6 days a week, for 2 intense weeks. By the end of the first week, Emma's physical therapist, Dr. Michael, had noticed measurable improvements in her gait stability and muscle strength. "Emma, you're doing remarkably well," Doctor told her during their assessment. "Your progress is ahead of our typical timelines. I think having Max with you helps. You're more confident, which allows your body to relax and engage in the therapy more effectively." Sarah, watching from the observation area, felt tears of gratitude and joy. The trip to Boston had been exactly what they needed. More importantly, the incident at the Denver airport had somehow catalyzed a shift in Emma's confidence that was translating directly into therapeutic progress. But while Emma was in Boston making remarkable physical advances, something else was happening back in Denver, something that would ultimately have far greater ripples. The video of the gate incident had been posted to social media by the businessman who had been recording. Within 48 hours, it had been shared across multiple platforms. By the end of the week, it had accumulated over 3 million views. News outlets picked up the story. Pilot denies disabled child service dog, then everything changes. Captain's heart-wrenching apology to epileptic girl and her service dog. One child's courage sparks conversation about disability rights. The story resonated with people for multiple reasons. There was the injustice of the initial refusal. There was the empowerment of watching Sarah stand up for her daughter's rights. There was the intervention of Dr. Hammond, demonstrating the importance of legal expertise. And most powerfully, there was the moment of genuine change, a man realizing he was wrong and making the decision to do better. The airline's corporate headquarters was flooded with emails and messages. Some were angry, denouncing Captain Mitchell's initial behavior, but many more were positive, praising the captain's willingness to listen and change. The airline's legal department immediately recognized the potential liability that had almost occurred and the PR advantage of the captain's genuine transformation. Within a week, the airline had issued an official statement. "We are committed to full ADA compliance and disability accommodation. We are grateful to the family who brought this important issue to our attention, and we are implementing comprehensive training programs for all flight crews to ensure that every passenger with service animals receives the welcome and accommodation they deserve." More significantly, Captain Mitchell was asked to take a lead role in developing that training program. He accepted immediately. Back home in Denver, had wasted no time in pursuing his own transformation. He and his wife, Jennifer, had contacted the same service dog organization that had trained Max. They were placed on a waiting list for a service dog candidate that would be matched to his daughter, Emma Mitchell. 3 weeks after the incident on Flight 427, attended his first formal ADA compliance training session for airline personnel. But he didn't attend as a student. He attended as a facilitator. He shared the story of Flight 427. He showed the video. And then he talked about the realization it had sparked, how fear and ignorance had nearly caused him to violate federal law and hurt a child. "I made a choice that day," told a room of 50 flight crew members, pilots, flight attendants, ground staff. "I made a choice based on fear of something I didn't understand. That choice could have had serious legal consequences for me and this airline. More importantly, it could have hurt a child who was already managing significant challenges. But I had the good fortune of meeting a civil rights attorney and a 7-year-old girl who forced me to reconsider. Not everyone gets that opportunity. I want to make sure you all have the information you need to make better choices than I almost did." The training program that helped develop became a model that other airlines began to adopt. Requests came in from competing airlines asking for guidance on similar programs. What had started as one captain's personal crisis became an industry conversation about disability accommodation and inclusive practices. News outlets continued to follow the story. When Emma returned from Boston to Denver with measurable improvements in her mobility, local television crews were waiting at the airport to interview her. Emma, still only 7 years old, spoke with remarkable eloquence about her experience with Max and about standing up for what was right. "The captain was scared of Max," Emma explained to a reporter, her small face sincere and thoughtful. "But Max isn't scary. Max is helpful. The captain didn't know that, so he thought something bad might happen. But when he learned about Max, he understood. And then he said sorry, and that made everything okay." The interview went viral again, shared by disability rights organizations, parent advocacy groups, and educational institutions focused on teaching children about courage and standing up for what's right. But perhaps the most touching development came 4 months after the incident. Captain Mitchell sat in the lobby of a service dog organization in suburban Denver, waiting to meet a German Shepherd puppy named Scout. Scout had been in training for 18 months and had just been matched to his 9-year-old daughter, Emma Mitchell. When the trainer brought Scout out, the young dog's entire body wiggled with excitement at meeting her new handler. Emma's daughter lit up with joy. Within minutes, the bond was forming, the same kind of profound connection that Emma Henderson had with Max. Called Sarah Henderson that evening. They had exchanged contact information during the aftermath of the airport incident, and an unlikely friendship had formed between the two families. Sarah answered on the second ring. "We got our Scout," said, and Sarah could hear the emotion in his voice. "She's extraordinary, and Emma is already becoming more confident. I can see the change happening in real time." "That's wonderful," Sarah said genuinely. "Emma's been asking about how your Emma was doing. She's going to be so happy to hear about Scout." "I wanted to tell you something," continued. "I've been asked to speak at a national disability rights conference next month. They want me to talk about my experience, the mistake I made, what I learned, and how one moment of courage changed multiple lives. I'm going to tell the whole story, Sarah. I'm going to tell them about your Emma and Max and what they taught me. I hope that's okay." "That's more than okay," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's exactly what needs to happen. The world needs to hear this story." 6 months after Flight 427, the ripple effects had become undeniable. The airline had implemented the most comprehensive ADA compliance training program in its history. Multiple other airlines had adopted similar programs. Captain Mitchell had become an unexpected advocate for disability rights, speaking at conferences and training sessions across the country. His daughter, Emma, was thriving with Scout's support. And throughout all of this, the story of a 7-year-old girl and her service dog standing firm in the face of injustice had become a touchstone moment for disability advocacy. Emma Henderson, meanwhile, had continued her physical therapy, and by 6 months post-Boston treatment, she had achieved mobility improvements that had exceeded even the doctor's optimistic projections. She walked with more confidence, experienced fewer seizures, and had an almost visible increase in self-assurance. Max remained by her side, his role evolving as Emma's capabilities improved, but no less essential to her. One afternoon, Sarah took Emma to the park near their house. Emma was playing on the grass, running in a way that her cerebral palsy had made challenging for years. Max ran alongside her, matching her pace perfectly, always ready to provide support if needed. Sarah watched her daughter, remembering the terrified little girl at the Denver airport gate just months before. That girl had stood up for herself and her service dog. That girl had, without realizing it, started a movement. That girl had changed an industry's approach to disability accommodation. Emma collapsed onto the grass, breathless and laughing, with Max flopping down beside her. Sarah sat down next to them, pulling Emma close. "Mommy," Emma said, still catching her breath, "did the captain's Emma get her service dog?" "Yes, sweetie," Sarah said. "She got a dog named Scout, and they're best friends now, just like you and Max are." "That's good," Emma said simply, "because service dogs help people, and everyone should have help when they need it." Sarah held her daughter close, marveling at the wisdom that sometimes came from the mouths of children. Emma hadn't set out to change an industry or transform a captain's perspective or create a ripple effect that would influence disability accommodation policies across the aviation industry. She had simply stood firm in her truth and refused to accept injustice. And in doing so, she had shown the world that sometimes the smallest voices carry the most powerful messages. Sometimes the most profound changes come not from policymakers or lawyers or industry leaders, but from a 7-year-old girl and her German Shepherd service dog, refusing to back down. Max rested his head on Emma's lap and she whispered to him, "We did it, buddy. We really did help people." And in a way that transcended the specifics of that one flight and that one airport gate, she was absolutely right. We try can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.